Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and I am back from my wedding and honeymoon. Before we start diving into some deeper topics, I'd figured I'd ease myself back into the swing of things with a fall-themed episode. And that leads us right into today's topic. This week, we are going to be looking at the history of corn mazes. Corn mazes themselves are a relatively new phenomenon, with the first credited corn maze having been created in 1993. It is entirely possible that corn mazes have existed before 1993, but the corn maze in 1993 is when we have our first record of a corn maze being advertised for public use. So just how did we get to mazes being in cornfields? I think to get the best picture, we should probably look to the hedge mazes that are popular in Europe and popular mythology surrounding the labyrinth. Now, when we're looking at labyrinths, they have a much longer history than the relatively short history of the corn maze, about 2,000 years longer than the first corn maze. The first labyrinths were created in ancient Greece, which rather than be a confusing path where there were multiple paths for you to choose, the labyrinth would have one continuous path that had been originally designed as more of a spiritual journey. Lovers of ancient Greek history, and even possibly my Percy Jackson fans out there, are probably familiar with the Cretan labyrinth, which housed the minotaur in the center. For those unfamiliar, the labyrinth at the center of this myth/history had been a maze that had been commissioned by King Minos to be designed by the architect Daedalus. To understand more about the labyrinth, we're going to look at the myth of Theseus a little bit. In the myth of Theseus, Theseus is thought to be the son of Poseidon, or King Aegis of Athens. Theseus' mother, Aethra, would not tell him who his father was until he was of age, where when he was of age, he was sent off and gathered sandals and a sword of his father's that had been left under a rock that would have been too heavy for him to lift prior to him being of age. With his new sandals and sword, Theseus went off to Athens to claim his inheritance from his father, as he was Aegis' only son. The inheritance in question, the entire city of Athens. Before getting to the city, he had to battle many villains and monsters. He battled Periaptes, who smashed in the heads of anyone who was in his way. Theseus killed him with no trouble. Next up was Sinis, who was famous for having bent pine trees so that he could quickly strike people who came into the Corinth countryside. Theseus killed him with a bent pine tree, of course. After him, Theseus came across Sciron, who blocked a narrow passage, who also took delight in forcing people to clean his feet and also kicking them off the side of a cliff, to an awaiting giant turtle who was very hungry to their untimely demise. Theseus eventually kicked Sciron over the cliff to be eaten by said turtle. After some run-ins with some other bad guys, Theseus eventually made it to Athens. After this excursion and some other side quests, Theseus, after hearing about the practice of sending off 7 young men and 7 young women off into the labyrinth every 9 years to feed the minotaur, decided that he was going to volunteer himself to eventually kill the minotaur. With help from some friends, he made his way through the labyrinth, keeping track of where he went using a ball of string to mark his path. He found his way to the minotaur's lair, and he struck the beast down with his sword. He was able to easily leave the labyrinth by following the path he had made with his string. Now, what about the real-life labyrinth? Having gone through many hundreds of years of being talked about, in 1878, a businessman named Minos Kalkarinos, who, having been inspired by others before him, decided to start digging, having been inspired by an excavation at Troy and Mycenae by Heinrich Schliemann. Now, that name may sound familiar to you if you ever took any class about archaeology or you have any interest in archaeology. Let's just say that his method of archaeology was very destructive and not something that is looked fondly on by modern-day archaeologists, or even his contemporaries. Anywho, Minos started digging south of where Schliemann had his dig and started to find the remains of a building that had some curious symbols carved in the wall. With the age of the building, he discovered the building was placed to be from the time of the original King Minos. Some actual archaeologists, having heard of the discovery, agreed that the building did in fact look ancient, but they actually identified the building as the Labyrinth from the myth. At this point, Minos was forced to stop his excavation as the site was located in Crete, which was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and there were worries about where the finds of the dig would end up being located, as there was some drama with the Ottoman Empire. A different businessman, Arthur Evans, visited the site in 1894, purchased some of the land, and waited until Cretan independence, where he resumed the excavation of the site. He uncovered the rest of the building between 1900 and 1904, even going on to do some restorations of the building. Moving on from ancient Greece, where we had the establishment of labyrinths, let's head into the world of hedge mazes. Hedge mazes, where the hedges used are often taller than the individual walking through, were most often used as ways to entertain royalty. These mazes had transitioned from one singular path to a path that contained many different dead ends, twists and turns, and even blind alleys. Even today, England still has their fascination with hedge mazes, with over 125 hedge mazes open to the public as we have moved on from just entertaining royalty. To make a hedge maze, quite a bit of work has to go into it. These mazes first start out as a plan on paper, like most other architectural endeavors, and even then the individual design of the maze would be heavily dependent on the size of the plot of land that the maze would be on. The bigger the maze, the more opportunity there was to confuse the visitors. They also had to consider what the goal of the maze would be. At the center of these hedge mazes, there would often be some type of pavilion or garden that would be a worthwhile reward for having been turned around through the process of traveling the course of the maze. Then came the selection of the type of shrubbery, which varied from box bushes to evergreen. The climate of the area would be the biggest determining factor in which shrubbery would be chosen. And only one kind of shrub would be used. You wanted a uniform look for your hedge maze. When it came time to actually build the hedge maze, the baby shrubs would be planted along the path, with trained topiary artists keeping them cut to an even thickness of about 25 inches thick and eventually up to 7 to 8 feet tall. They would even practice something called plashing, where they will intertwine the branches of neighboring shrubs so that visitors could not see through the wall of greenery, making the puzzle that much harder. And that was not a quick process. It takes years for hedge mazes to grow properly, sometimes up to 7 years of continued pruning before a hedge maze would be considered complete. Hedge mazes have maintained their popularity in England, with the aforementioned 125 current hedge mazes open to the public. So now we know about hedge mazes, but what about the corn maze? That's why you clicked on today's episode. So the corn maze, like I mentioned at the top of today's episode, came about in 1993. But why 1993? Well, in 1993, the Midwest experienced a water event known as the Great Flood, which devastated many farms throughout the region. The Great Flood of 1993 resulted from above normal soil moisture levels along the Missouri and Mississippi River due to an increase in rain in 1992. In 1993, there was a persistent, repetitive storm pattern that, quote, bombarded the upper Midwest with voluminous rainfall amounts, which is quoted from the National Weather Service. Some areas received upwards of 4 feet of rain, with 12 inches of rain falling between June and August 1993 in the eastern Dakotas, southern Minnesota, eastern Nebraska, Wisconsin, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. There were multiple floods along these rivers throughout this season, with 15 deaths attributed to floods and over $15 billion in damages. During this summer, hundreds of levees along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers failed, leading to many of these floods. A large portion of the damage caused by these floods was contained in many farms across the flooded area. In an effort to help aid in the aftermath of the floods, Don France and Joanne Marks planned and executed a corn maze where they would charge admission, and the proceeds from the admission would be donated to the Red Cross to help the victims of the flood. The resulting corn maze was made over 3 acres of land and was made in the shape of a dinosaur who they called Cornelius. The complete maze was just short of 2 miles long with a completed length of 1.92 miles. Having finished in September of 1993, the maze was open for just 2 weekends where each guest was charged $5 in admission. The maze raised $27,000 in its opening weekend and attracted over 6,000 visitors in its first weekend open to the public. Having opened as the largest corn maze ever created, corn mazes have continued to grow in popularity and are a popular activity for Americans in the fall. Today, corn mazes themselves have also grown in size tremendously. In Dixon, California, there is a corn maze that has twice held the record for largest corn maze, with a maze made on a 40-acre plot of land. It can take visitors anywhere from 45 minutes to 2.5 hours to complete this maze. Brothers Matt and Mark spend time every year coming up with a unique design so that their corn maze is never the same. I've been to a few corn mazes, nothing quite as large as 40 acres, but I've always had a fun time. Did you know that corn mazes came from an effort to aid those in need? And have you ever been lost in a corn maze? Let me know. And that's where I'm going to end today's episode on corn mazes. I have just one last question for you this week. Do you plan on getting lost in a corn maze this fall? Sources for today's episode include an article titled The Winding History of the Maze by Natasha Geiling from Smithsonian Magazine, an article titled Myths of the Labyrinth, Uncovering the Myths of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur by Andrew Shapland, and the National Weather Service. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to today's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.